the women had to appear grateful. Any sign of reluctance, fear, or worst of all, physical impurity meant immediate consequences. You don't learn this in your high school history class, but these women lived in constant terror of their own biology. Here's how a typical selection night unfolded, based on palace records from 1640. The chief black eunuch, a man named Sunbul Aga, would enter the harem quarters at precisely 8 p.m. The women would be assembled in the Golden Hall, standing in rows like products in a showroom. The silver tray would be carried through the corridors by 2 junior eunuchs, while guards cleared the path. The journey from the Sultan's chambers to the harem took exactly 12 minutes. They timed it. On November 15th, 1640, a woman named Aze was selected. The records show she was 17, from Circassia, and had been in the harem for 3 years. When the eunuchs came to collect her, they discovered she was in her monthly cycle. The Ottoman Empire wants you to forget this part. She never made it to morning. The official record lists her cause of death as sudden illness. The unofficial reality? She faced immediate consequences for a biological function she couldn't control. But the selection was just the beginning of the nightmare. The documents reveal something even darker. If a woman was chosen and deemed suitable, she would be escorted to preparation chambers. There, 12 eunuchs-trained medical inspectors would surround her. They would ask a single question that determined her fate. Should the seed be preserved? This wasn't poetry. This was a clinical evaluation of whether a woman deserved to keep her reproductive organs. If the answer was no, procedures would be scheduled. If yes, she would proceed to the Sultan's chambers, knowing that any failure to conceive within a specific time frame meant revisiting that terrible question. The statistics paint a horrifying picture. Out of 400 women in the harem at any given time, only 10 would ever bear children. Only 10. The rest existed in a state of perpetual waiting, knowing that being forgotten was actually the best-case scenario. Because here's what the textbooks leave out. Being chosen repeatedly without producing an heir meant you became a liability. On March 3, 1652, palace records show 23 women were relocated in a single night. All had been chosen multiple times without conceiving. Their destination? The official records say, reassignment. Witness accounts from servants paint a different picture, one involving the dark waters of the Bosphorus. But it gets worse. The psychological torture of the selection system was intentional. Dr. Fatma Muge Göçek, a modern Ottoman historian, discovered documents showing that the randomness was carefully calibrated. They wanted women to feel hope, just enough to prevent mass despair, but not enough to feel secure. It was psychological warfare perfected over centuries. The selection process also served another purpose that most people don't realize. It created competition among the women. Instead of uniting against their oppressors, they turned on each other. Women would sabotage rivals, report on each other's biological schedules, and celebrate when others were relocated. The system turned victims into accomplices. One French ambassador, Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, wrote in 1675, "The women of the seraglio live in such fear of the silver tray that many resort to drinking potions that damage their ability to bear children, preferring certain barrenness to the uncertainty of selection." Think about that. Women were permanently destroying their bodies to avoid the possibility of being chosen. Here's what the textbooks leave out about the economics behind this horror. Each woman in the harem represented a significant investment. They were purchased, trained, clothed, and fed. The Ottoman Empire spent the equivalent of $2 million in today's money annually just on harem maintenance. But they considered it worthwhile because the system served multiple purposes: ensuring pure bloodlines, preventing political alliances through marriage, and maintaining absolute control over succession. The religious justifications make it even more disturbing. Islamic law was twisted beyond recognition to support this system. Natural biological functions were declared impure, not by religious texts, but by palace administrators who needed excuses for disposal. Pregnancy outside of official selection was deemed theft from the Sultan, as if women's bodies were state property. Modern historians are just now uncovering the full scope of how the selection system worked. Digital analysis of palace records reveals patterns that contemporary observers missed. Selection wasn't truly random. Women from certain regions were chosen more frequently. Ages 16 to 18 were preferred, and those who showed signs of intelligence or education were systematically overlooked. The Sultan wanted bodies, not minds. Makes modern dating apps look like paradise, doesn't it? Today, we swipe left or right on potential matches. Back then, a swipe of the pen could mean death. We complain about ghosting. They dealt with actual ghosts. Your worst Tinder date beats their best night in the palace. But here's the truly insane part that connects to our next section. In this system designed to destroy women, one 15-year-old girl not only survived but conquered. She beat the lottery of death by becoming something worse than her captors. And it gets worse, because her story shows that sometimes the only way to survive in hell is to become a demon yourself. Now let's talk about the 15-year-old girl who beat this death lottery by becoming history's most calculating survivor. Her name was Alexandra Lisowska, though history remembers her as Roxolana or Hurrem Sultan. And if you think you know manipulation, wait until you hear how this teenager turned systematic abuse into a pathway to becoming one of the most powerful women in history. Picture this. It's 1520 in the Ukrainian countryside. A 15-year-old girl is helping her father, an Orthodox priest, prepare for Sunday service. She's picking wildflowers in the wheat fields when Crimean Tatar raiders appear on the horizon. Within hours, her entire life is erased. Her family is slaughtered, her village burned, and she's thrown into chains with dozens of other girls. Destination: the slave markets of Istanbul. Imagine being ripped from your family at 15 and deciding your only option is to become the monster. That's exactly what Alexandra did. But here's what makes her story truly disturbing. She didn't just adapt to the system that enslaved her. She mastered it, manipulated it, and ultimately made it serve her purposes, leaving a trail of bodies in her wake. The transformation began the moment she entered the palace. While other girls cried for their families, Alexandra was studying. She realized tears meant weakness, and weakness meant death. So she created Roxolana, a persona so perfectly crafted that even she eventually forgot who Alexandra had been. The documented evidence of her calculated rise to power will shock you. Palace records from 1521 show that within 6 months of arrival, she had mastered Turkish, Arabic, and Persian. Not just conversational skills-perfect fluency, other harem women reported seeing her practice until her mouth bled, repeating phrases over and over until her accent disappeared. She understood that language wasn't just communication, it was camouflage. But language was just her first weapon. The truly disturbing part was how she studied Sultan Suleiman like he was a puzzle to be solved. She memorized his routines, his preferences, his moods. When he liked poetry, she became a poet. When he showed interest in politics, she developed opinions that perfectly complemented his. She didn't just mirror him, she became his intellectual complement. Here's what the textbooks leave out about her tactics. Roxolana pioneered psychological manipulation techniques that wouldn't be formally studied for another 400 years. She used what modern psychologists call intermittent reinforcement, sometimes warm, sometimes distant, always unpredictable. She made Suleiman addicted to figuring her out. In 1524, she pulled off her first major manipulation. The palace caught fire, a common occurrence in wooden structures with oil lamps. While everyone else fled in panic, Roxolana stayed behind, risking her life to save Suleiman's favorite manuscript of poetry. Except here's what most people don't realize. Forensic analysis of the fire patterns suggests it started in a storage room only Roxolana had access to. She created the crisis to become the hero. The marriage coup of 1534 shows her true genius. For 500 years, Ottoman sultans never married. They took concubines, had children, but marriage was forbidden. It created legal complications for succession. Roxolana changed that. She convinced Suleiman that their love transcended tradition. Modern historians have found her letters from this period, and their masterclasses in manipulation. Every word calculated, every emotion precisely calibrated to push Suleiman toward breaking half a millennium of precedent. But here's where the story gets truly dark. Once married, Roxolana's survival instinct transformed into something monstrous. She had 6 children with Suleiman, but that wasn't enough. The heir apparent, Prince Mustafa, was Suleiman's son from another woman. He was popular, competent, and by all accounts would have made an excellent sultan. He had to go. The assassination took 3 years to orchestrate. Roxolana didn't use poison or assassins, too obvious. Instead, she planted seeds of doubt. She had agents spread rumors about Mustafa's ambitions. She forged letters suggesting rebellion. She arranged for Suleiman to accidentally overhear conversations about Mustafa's growing power. Every piece of evidence was deniable, every whisper untraceable. In 1553, Suleiman ordered his own son strangled. Roxolana watched from behind a screen as the Ottoman Empire's most promising prince was murdered on false charges she had fabricated. Witnesses reported she showed no emotion. She had become exactly what the system demanded, a survivor without conscience. Her poetry from this period reveals the true horror of her transformation. On the surface, they're beautiful love poems to Suleiman, but analyzing them now, knowing what we know, they read like psychological warfare. One verse translates to, "My Sultan, my life's only light. Without you, all is endless night. Your wisdom sees what others cannot see. Your justice flows like the endless sea." She wrote this the week after manipulating him into killing his son, every line designed to reinforce his decision, to paint his paranoia as wisdom, his cruelty as justice. She had learned the ultimate lesson of the harem. Love was just another weapon. But the most disturbing aspect of Roxolana's story isn't what she did, it's why she had to do it. In the Ottoman system, there was no retirement plan for aging concubines. Once her children were grown, once Suleiman's interest waned, she would have been disposed of like the thousands before her. Her monstrous actions were rational responses to an irrational system. Documents discovered in 2018 show she maintained a network of over 150 informants throughout the palace. She knew every plot, every whisper, every potential threat to her children's succession. She turned the harem's culture of betrayal into her personal intelligence service. The oppressed became the oppressor, but can we really blame her? Modern historians struggle with Roxolana's legacy. Dr. Duval's Leslie Pierce, who wrote the definitive biography, calls her a feminist icon wrapped in a war criminal's resume. She shattered gender barriers by becoming a political advisor, architectural patron, and diplomatic correspondent. She also directly caused the deaths of at least 40 people, including children who posed threats to her sons. Today we call this Stockholm Syndrome, but she called it Tuesday. Every morning, she woke up next to the man who owned her, in the palace that imprisoned her, wearing jewels paid for by slave trading. And she smiled. She wrote him love poems. She bore him children, all while orchestrating murders with her other hand. The price of survival in impossible systems is often your soul, and Roxolana paid in full. She died in 1558, the only woman in Ottoman history to be buried in a tomb adjacent to a sultan. She had beaten the system by becoming worse than the system. From Ukrainian priest's daughter to slave to sultana to killer trauma had forged the ultimate survivor. Her last letter to Suleiman, written on her deathbed, might be the most chilling document in Ottoman history. "My Sultan, I go ahead to prepare paradise for your arrival. Every decision I made was for our dynasty. History will remember our love. Let them forget the rest." She knew exactly what she had done, and she felt no remorse. Because in a palace where 397 out of 400 women died forgotten, she had chosen to live as a monster rather than die as a victim. The truly disturbing part? Given the same circumstances, how many of us would make the same choice? But Roxolana was the exception. Most women faced a different fate. They couldn't manipulate their way to power or murder their way to safety. For them, the palace had other plans. Methods of disposal so civilized, they make medieval torture look honest. Here's where the Ottoman palace turned into a factory of creative murder. And I use the word creative because these weren't your standard historical executions. No public beheadings or hangings here. The Ottomans had a problem. They needed to kill women regularly, but Islamic law forbade spilling royal blood and religious sensibilities demanded clean deaths. So they innovated. They turned murder into an art form where the canvas was human suffering and the paint was silk and seawater. Let me paint you a picture of institutionalized femicide so refined that it had employee handbooks. The palace employed professional stranglers. That was their actual job title, bostanci, the gardeners. Except instead of pruning roses, they pruned the Sultan's human garden. These men were selected for their discretion, trained in anatomy, and practiced on animals until they could perform their duties in under 30 seconds. Your natural bodily functions could sign your death warrant. Imagine living every day knowing that a biological process you couldn't control might trigger your execution. The silk strangulation wasn't random torture. It was specifically chosen because it left no marks, spilled no blood, and could be completed quickly and quietly. The clean death for the unclean woman. The Bostanci used a specific technique passed down through generations. 3 feet of silk cord, twisted 7 times for strength. One man would hold the victim's shoulders, another would perform the act. The whole process was so standardized they had quality control. If it took longer than 45 seconds, the executioner faced punishment for causing unnecessary suffering. Think about that. They had performance reviews for murder. But here's what the textbooks leave out. The psychological torture preceded the physical act. Women marked for strangulation weren't killed immediately. They were informed at sunset and executed at sunrise, giving them exactly 1 night to prepare their souls. Palace records show most spent these hours writing letters that would never be sent to families they'd never see again. The sack punishment. Let's talk about what this actually meant. The Ottoman Empire wants you to forget this part, but it's documented in multiple European ambassadors' reports. Women who became pregnant without official permission faced the deniz cezarsi, the sea punishment. They would be sewn into leather sacks along with several cats. Not for company. The cats were there to create movement and panic, ensuring the woman couldn't hold her breath or float. The execution squad had a specific boat for this purpose, painted black and launched only on moonless nights. They would row to a predetermined spot in the Bosphorus, where the currents guaranteed bodies would be swept out to the Black Sea. The truly disturbing part? This was considered merciful compared to what Christian kingdoms did to adulteresses. The Ottomans actually thought they were being progressive. From 1520 to 1680, Ottoman records indicate at least 3,000 women met their end in the Bosphorus. That's 18 women per year, every year, for 160 years. The strait became such a common dumping ground that local fishermen developed superstitions about certain areas. They called them mermaid graveyards and refused to fish there. But not all disposals were violent. Sometimes the cruelest death was no death at all. Banishment to the Eski Saray, the old palace, was psychological execution. Women past their prime, or who had committed minor infractions, were sent to this decaying building on the outskirts of Istanbul. No visitors, no letters, no hope, just hundreds of discarded women waiting to die. A French diplomat who visited in 1670 described it: a marble tomb filled with living ghosts. Women who enter young emerge as corpses, if they emerge at all. The silence is so complete, you can hear hearts breaking. The women there developed their own sign language because speaking was discouraged. They created an entire culture of the condemned. The economics of execution were precisely calculated. A silk strangulation cost 3 aksa, the price of a good meal. A drowning expedition cost 20 aksa, including boat rental and crew wages. Banishment cost nothing except the one-time transport. The empire kept detailed ledgers of execution expenses. Murder had a budget line. Here's what most people don't realize. The guards who carried out these executions weren't monsters. They were regular palace employees with families and children. Many developed severe psychological problems. Palace medical records from the 1600s show executioners had the highest rates of melancholy and night terrors of any palace staff. One strangler's journal, discovered in 1987, contains 400 pages of apologies to his victims. The bureaucracy of death extended to record-keeping. Every execution was documented in triplicate. Date, time, method, reason, and disturbingly, a satisfaction rating from supervising officials. They literally had customer service standards for murder. A good execution was quick, quiet, and left no evidence. A poor one created complications or took too long. Religious justification made it all possible. Palace clerics issued fatwas declaring that women who disrupted harem harmony were spreading corruption, and their elimination was not just permissible but necessary. They quoted scripture, while authorizing murder, turning holy texts into execution orders. The mental gymnastics required to reconcile mercy with murder created an entire theological subcategory. The most disturbing execution method was reserved for women who tried to escape. They faced tash cezasu, the stone punishment. Not stoning, as you might think. Instead, they were sealed inside palace walls while still alive. Archaeologists renovating Topkapi Palace in 2010 discovered human remains inside multiple walls, confirming what had long been rumored. These women were literally erased from existence, becoming part of the structure that imprisoned them. Makes medieval European executions look merciful, doesn't it? At least those were public spectacles with some twisted sense of justice. These were private erasures, industrial-scale disappearances that left no martyrs, no stories, no warnings for others. Just empty beds and new arrivals to fill them. The perverse logic of humane murder reached its peak with the development of poisoning protocols. For women of higher status, those who had borne children or held titles, strangulation was considered too degrading. Instead, they received sherbet, ikas, special sherbet. It tasted of almonds and worked within hours. The palace employed a chief poisoner who maintained a garden of toxic plants and tested new formulas on condemned criminals. But the palace didn't just consume women, it devoured children too. And if you thought the harem system was horrific, wait until you hear about the devsherm, the child collection system that makes modern human trafficking look amateur. Because at least traffickers today try to hide their crimes. The Ottomans made it official state policy. If you thought the women had it bad, wait until you hear what happened to 12-year-old boys. The Ottoman Empire didn't just wait for slaves to come to them. They had a collection system so efficient Amazon would be jealous. It was called the devsherm, which literally translates to collection or gathering. Sounds harmless, right? Like they were collecting taxes or tribute. Except the tribute was children, and the tax was paid in human lives. Every 3 to 7 years, Ottoman officials would fan out across their Christian territories: Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, Bosnia, Albania. Their mission? Shop for boys like they were selecting livestock. And I'm not being metaphorical. They literally had specifications. Height requirements, dental examinations, intelligence tests. The Ottoman Empire had quality control standards for child abduction. Imagine government officials showing up to evaluate your son like livestock. The scene would unfold the same way in every village. Ottoman soldiers would surround the settlement at dawn. The devshirm Arsa, the collection officer, would set up in the town square. All Christian boys between 8 and 18 were required to present themselves. Muslim boys were exempt, creating a perverse incentive for families to convert, though that was often forbidden too. The selection process was thorough and terrifying. Boys were stripped naked in public, examined for physical defects, tested for intelligence and strength. The officer would check teeth like they were buying horses, measure heights, evaluate muscle tone. Parents watched their children being assessed like meat, knowing that selection meant never seeing them again. Here's what the textbooks leave out: the quotas. Each region had to provide a specific number of boys based on population. If they couldn't find enough suitable candidates, standards would lower. In bad years, they'd take boys as young as 6 or as old as 20. The only absolute requirement? They had to be Christian. The empire needed children with no connection to Islamic law that might protect them. The selected boys were marked, literally. They received a special tattoo or brand that identified them as devshirm. Then began what survivors later called the Death March. The journey to Istanbul could take months. Boys from the Balkans walked up to 1,000 miles, chained together in groups of 100. No wagons, no horses walking was part of the breaking process. The Death March was engineered attrition. Weak boys died on the road, saving the empire future investment. Survivors arrived at Istanbul traumatized, exhausted, and pliable. Ottoman records show a 20% mortality rate during transport. That's 1 in 5 boys dead before training even began. The empire considered this acceptable loss as natural selection for future janissaries. One account from a European merchant in 1544 describes encountering a devshirm convoy. A river of children flows toward Constantinople. Every few miles, the chain grows shorter as boys collapse. The guards don't stop. They cut the dead from the chain and continue. Mothers follow at a distance, weeping, until soldiers drive them back. It is the harvest of sorrow. Upon arrival in Istanbul, the psychological demolition intensified. Boys were given new names, Muslim names. Their Christian names were forbidden, punishable by beating. They were circumcised, often without anesthesia, as a physical mark of their new identity. They were forbidden from speaking their native languages. Boys caught praying in their original faith faced severe punishment. But here's the truly insidious part. The successful ones became zealots. The system was designed to create fanatics more loyal to the Sultan than any natural-born subject. These stolen children became the Janissaries' elite soldiers who would later raid Christian villages to steal more children. The oppressed became oppressors, perpetuating the cycle. The training schools, called Asemi Olan, were psychological reconditioning centers. Boys learned Turkish, Arabic, martial arts, and absolute obedience. But the real education happened after hours. Older boys, already broken and remade, enforced the system on newcomers. The guards didn't need to traumatize every child. The children did it to each other. European observers were uniformly horrified. An Austrian ambassador wrote in 1562, "They take Christian children and return them as perfect enemies of Christ." The transformation is so complete that these boys would gladly kill their own fathers if ordered. It is a factory that takes souls and produces weapons. The numbers are staggering. Between 1450 and 1650, the Ottoman Empire collected approximately 200,000 Christian boys. That's 1,000 children per year, every year, for 2 centuries. Entire regions were depopulated of young males. Some Balkan villages had no boys between 10 and 18 for generations. Parents developed desperate strategies to save their children. They would maim boys, cutting off thumbs or toes to make them unsuitable for military service. They married them young, as married boys were sometimes exempt. They hid them in mountains or monasteries. Some families killed their own sons rather than let them be taken. The Devshirme turned parents into either mutilators or murderers. The economic impact was calculated and cruel. The empire saved massive recruitment costs by stealing children. They eliminated potential rebels by taking them young. They created administrators and soldiers with no local loyalties or family ties. From a cold, bureaucratic perspective, it was genius. From a human perspective, it was industrialized child abuse. Some Devshirme boys rose to incredible heights: grand viziers, provincial governors, military commanders. The system's defenders point to these success stories. See, they say, these boys had opportunities they never would have had in their villages. It's the same argument human traffickers use today, that they're providing opportunities. The fact that 1 in 100 became powerful doesn't excuse stealing the other 99. Today we'd call this human trafficking and systematic abuse. The UN would impose sanctions. The International Criminal Court would issue arrest warrants. But for 400 years, this was official policy of one of the world's most powerful empires. It was so normalized that Ottoman historians wrote about it matter-of-factly, like describing tax collection. The psychological damage passed through generations. Modern studies of Balkan folklore find recurring nightmares about child-stealing demons. Genetic studies show population bottlenecks in certain regions, corresponding to Devshirme collection periods. The trauma is literally written in DNA and cultural memory. The last official Devshirme occurred in 1648, though unofficial collections continued into the 1700s. The system ended not because of moral awakening, but because it became economically inefficient. Firearms made elite infantry less crucial. Muslim families began bribing officials to take their children for the opportunities. The perverted system collapsed under its own twisted logic. But here's the most disturbing realization. Many of these boys weren't destined for military service. The prettiest, the most delicate, the most intelligent, they had a different fate. They were sent to the palace schools where education meant something far darker than reading and writing. The same halls that taught mathematics also taught children their bodies were currency. The same halls that taught mathematics also taught children their bodies were currency. Welcome to the palace schools, the Enderun, where the Ottoman Empire manufactured perfect servants through a curriculum that would make modern child protective services mobilize entire armies. This wasn't education. It was systematic programming using children as raw material. The palace school occupied the third courtyard of Topkapi Palace, architecturally beautiful with its marble columns and intricate tile work, but beauty masked horror. Behind those ornate doors, 300 to 400 boys aged 10 to 18 lived in a hierarchical system so twisted that survivors rarely spoke of it. When they did, their accounts were dismissed as exaggeration. Recent archaeological evidence proves they were understating the reality. Imagine going to school where your grades depended on more than your test scores, where advancement required surrendering not just your mind but your body, where teachers had absolute power and students had no word for consent because the concept didn't exist. This was daily life in the Enderun. The official curriculum looked impressive: languages, mathematics, Islamic theology, music, calligraphy, martial arts. Boys learned to speak multiple languages fluently, solve complex equations, compose poetry, and fight with various weapons. On paper, it was one of the world's most advanced educational institutions. In practice, it was a grooming factory. Here's what the textbooks leave out: the night curriculum. After formal classes ended, a different education began. The dormitories operated on a strict hierarchy. New boys, called Isolan, occupied the lowest rung. Above them were the Falaka, and at the top, the Hasoda. This wasn't just organization, it was a predation structure. Senior students had rights over younger ones. These rights were codified, systematic, and enforced by the school administration. A French observer in 1650 wrote, "The beautiful boys are passed around like communal property. Those who resist face beatings or starvation. Those who comply receive privileges." The teachers not only know, they orchestrate it. The palace had specific terms for these arrangements. A senior student who claimed a younger boy was called a lala. The younger boy became their icholan. The language sanitized abuse as mentorship. Palace records show these guardianships were registered, taxed, and transferred like property contracts. But it gets worse. The twice-yearly school exhibitions weren't just academic presentations. Boys were dressed in specific costumes: tight trousers, open vests, makeup, and paraded before palace officials and visiting dignitaries. The Austrian ambassador reported in 1665, "They paint boys like women and make them dance in ways that would shame prostitutes. The audience bids for favorites." Modern historians have found accounting ledgers from these events. Boys were rented out for private tutoring sessions. The school took a 60% cut. The remaining 40% went into an account the boy could access upon graduation, if he graduated. They were literally saving money earned from their own abuse. The medical examinations tell their own horrific story. Palace doctors kept detailed records of injuries, diseases, and treatments. Reading between the lines of clinical language reveals systematic assault. Rectal fissures appeared in 40% of students. Throat inflammations were endemic. Melancholic temperament requiring isolation was the euphemism for suicide attempts. The suicide rate was staggering but hidden. Boys who killed themselves were recorded as dying from sudden illness or accidents. One palace guard's diary, discovered in 1923, lists 31 boys who fell from the same tower between 1640 and 1645. The tower had safety railings. The guard knew they jumped, but was ordered to report falls. Psychological manipulation accompanied physical abuse. Boys were taught that their suffering was holy, that submitting made them better Muslims, that resisting showed spiritual weakness. Palace imams issued religious rulings declaring that serving seniors was a form of worship. They twisted scripture to normalize trauma. The few who tried to escape faced creative punishments designed to break spirits without damaging valuable assets. The marble treatment involved standing naked on cold marble for hours. The silence room was solitary confinement with sensory deprivation. The memory hole was a pit where boys were lowered and left in darkness, fed just enough to survive. European visitors were consistently horrified but also complicit. The Venetian ambassador wrote in 1670, "The things I witnessed in the palace school would be considered demonic in Christian lands. Yet my own countrymen bid highest for an evening's entertainment. They condemned the system while participating in it." The graduates of this system fell into three categories. Some became janissaries or administrators, channeling their trauma into fanatic loyalty. Others became palace eunuchs, physically altered to serve in the harem. The third group, the broken ones, were quietly disposed of when they became too damaged to function. Here's what most people don't realize. This system created the Ottoman Empire's most effective administrators. Grand viziers, military commanders, provincial governors, many were products of the palace schools. Their shared trauma created an unbreakable bond. They protected each other and the system that made them. The training methods were so effective that other powers tried to replicate them. The Safavid Persians created similar schools. The Mughal Indians imported Ottoman educators. The system spread because it worked. If you define working as creating absolutely loyal, completely broken servants. One survivor's account, written in 1701 after escaping to Venice, provides rare insight. They took my name, my faith, my innocence. They gave me knowledge, power, and nightmares that last a lifetime. I speak 7 languages but scream in my mother tongue. I command thousands but cannot command the memories to stop. Makes modern educational complaints seem trivial, doesn't it? We worry about standardized testing and homework loads. They worried about surviving until morning. We debate about school uniforms. They were dressed for auction. We complain about boring teachers. They faced predators with lesson plans. The palace school finally closed in 1909 during the Young Turk Revolution. The building still stands, now part of the Topkapi Palace Museum. Tourists walk through halls where children were broken, admiring architecture built on suffering. The guidebooks mention the excellent education provided. They don't mention the cost. But numbers don't lie, even when histories do. The Ottoman Empire kept meticulous records, financial ledgers, population counts, execution logs. When you compile this data, patterns emerge that reveal industrial-scale femicide and systematic child abuse. The mathematics of misery painted a picture the empire tried to hide. Let's talk about the statistics that reveal industrial-scale femicide. The Ottoman Empire kept records like a modern corporation. Every purchase, every death, every disappeared woman, catalogued in ledgers that survived when the women didn't. When historians finally gained access to these archives in the 1960s, what they found challenged every romanticized notion of harem life. The numbers don't lie. 400 women enter, 3 survive to old age. This isn't hyperbole or estimation. This is documented fact from palace records spanning 1520 to 1680. For every success story like Roxolana, 130 women simply vanished into historical silence. Their names appear on entry logs and expense reports. Then nothing. They became statistical ghosts. Imagine your name being pulled from a hat, but instead of winning a prize, you might lose your life. Now imagine that happening to 397 out of 400 women. That's not a game of chance. That's systematic extermination with silk cushions. Here's how the horrifying math breaks down. The average harem contained 300 to 400 women at any given time. The average residence duration was 4.7 years. Not because women were released or married off, because they died or disappeared. The turnover rate was so high that the palace had recruitment quotas. They needed 80 to 100 new women annually just to maintain numbers. The age demographics tell their own story. Entry age averaged 14 to 16 years old. The median age in the harem was 19. By age 25, women were considered mature. By 30, they were elderly. Finding a woman over 35 in the general harem was so rare that they were considered statistical anomalies. Where did they all go? Palace expenditure records provide clues. The budget for relocations averaged 3,000 gold coins annually. That's enough to transport approximately 150 women. But transport where? The destinations listed include Eski Saray, provincial assignments, and the chilling euphemism special arrangements. Following the money trail leads to the Bosphorus ferry operators who received regular payments for night services. The death certificates, when they existed, paint a pattern of impossible coincidences. Between 1550 and 1650, palace records show 847 women died of sudden illness, 623 died of melancholy, 445 died of accidents, 234 died of unknown causes, 89 died in childbirth complications. That's 2,238 deaths in a century, from a population that never exceeded 400 at any time. The turnover was so complete that the entire harem population was essentially replaced every 5 years. But the Unchosen suffered a different kind of death psychological annihilation. Of the 400 women in the harem, only 10 to 15 would ever be selected by the Sultan. The rest lived in perpetual waiting. They were fed, clothed, educated, and forgotten. Imagine spending your entire youth preparing for a moment that never comes, in a prison you can never leave. The financial investment in this system of death was staggering. Each woman cost approximately 50 gold coins to purchase, 20 gold coins annually to maintain, 5 gold coins to relocate. The Ottoman Empire spent roughly 40,000 gold coins per year on the harem, equivalent to $8 million today. They literally budgeted for systematic murder, with line items for silk cords and nighttime boat rides. The human hourglass visualization makes it clear. Picture 400 grains of sand at the top, young women entering the harem. The narrow middle represents the few selected for the sultan. The bottom shows where they end up. 3 grains representing survivors, 397 scattered to the wind. This hourglass reset every 5 years for 500 years. Cross-referencing palace records with city death registries reveals disturbing gaps. Women who left the palace rarely appeared in any other official documents. They didn't show up in marriage records, tax rolls, or death certificates elsewhere. They simply ceased to exist in any bureaucratic sense. The empire had perfected the art of making people disappear. Modern human trafficking pales in comparison when you examine the scale. Current estimates suggest 40 million people are trapped in modern slavery worldwide. The Ottoman Empire, with a fraction of today's population, processed approximately 200,000 women through the harem system over 500 years. Adjusted for population, that would be equivalent to 10 million today. The medical records are equally damning. Palace doctors documented widespread malnutrition despite abundant food, epidemic levels of hysteria and melancholy, unusually high rates of accidents and sudden illnesses, pregnancy rates far below biological norms. The efficiency of replacement tells its own story. When plague struck Istanbul in 1625, killing 60 harem women in a week, the palace had fully restocked within 2 months. They had supply chains for human beings more efficient than their military logistics. Slave markets from Circassia to Sudan had standing orders. One statistical anomaly deserves special attention. During the reign of Sultan Ibrahim, harem deaths spiked 300%. His particular tastes required larger women, so hundreds of unsuitable residents were disposed of to make room. The bureaucracy of death scaled up without hesitation. They tripled the relocation budget and increased boat service frequency. The generational trauma becomes visible in fertility statistics. Women who survived to become Valide sultans had an average of 2.3 children, far below the biological norm for the era. Even those who won the harem, lottery carried physical and psychological damage that affected reproduction. The system literally broke women's bodies. But here's the most chilling statistic: the normalization rate. New arrivals showed signs of severe distress for an average of 6 months. After that, they adapted. They stopped trying to escape. They stopped crying. They accepted their fate. The palace had calculated exactly how long it took to break a human spirit and built their training programs around it. Modern economists studying Ottoman records have calculated the ROI of oppression. Each woman generated an average economic value of 200 gold coins through labor, entertainment, and reproductive potential. They cost 75 gold coins total. That's a 166% return on investment. The empire profited from systematic femicide. The horror of bureaucratized murder becomes clear when you see the forms. Actual government documents with checkboxes for disposal methods, efficiency ratings for executioners, budget allocations for body removal. They had turned murder into paperwork, suffering into spreadsheets. But how did this 500-year nightmare finally end? It took the collapse of an entire civilization to stop this systematic horror. And even then, the system fought to survive, its defenders using every tool from religion to economics to justify the unjustifiable. It took the collapse of an entire civilization to end this systematic horror. The Ottoman Empire didn't willingly abandon its 500-year-old human trafficking system. It was ripped away as the empire crumbled. And even then, defenders fought viciously to preserve their privilege to own, abuse, and murder women. The beginning of the end came with the Tanzimat reforms of 1839. Sultan Abdulmajid I, under pressure from European powers and internal reformists, issued the Hatti Sharif of Gulhain, the imperial edict of the Rose Garden. Sounds poetic, right? Except this rose garden was fertilized with the bones of thousands of women, and the roses had thorns of resistance. Imagine being ripped from your family at 15 and deciding your only option is to become the monster. Now imagine you're a palace official who spent 40 years profiting from that system. The reforms threatened everything: your income, your status, your access to disposable humans. These men didn't go quietly. The resistance was immediate and violent. Palace eunuchs organized what historians now call the Harem Revolt of 1840. They spread rumors that ending slavery would anger Allah. They bribed clerics to issue fatwas declaring reform sinful. They accidentally strangled 3 reformist officials. The message was clear: change meant war. But here's what most people don't realize. The strongest resistance came from within the harem itself. Many older women, especially the Valide Sultan and senior Khalfa, fought reform. They had survived by becoming part of the system. Freedom threatened their power. Stockholm Syndrome had become institutional culture. The reform attempts reveal just how entrenched the horror was. The 1854 Slavery Abolition Decree specifically exempted the imperial harem. The 1876 Constitution guaranteed human rights, except for palace women. Every step forward included carve-outs for the Sultan's human collection. It was like trying to end slavery while keeping the plantation. Real change required external force. The Young Turk Revolution of 1908 brought military officers who had no investment in the harem system. They occupied the palace, documented the horrors, and began releasing women. What they found shocked even hardened soldiers. The last generation of harem women told stories that historians are still struggling to process. One woman, freed in 1909 at age 60, had been in the palace since age 12. She didn't know her real name. She had no memory of life outside walls. When offered freedom, she begged to stay. The outside world terrified her more than her silk prison. The testimony of Sophia Noor, recorded in 1924, captures the tragedy. They tell me I am free now. Free to do what? I know 13 ways to pleasure a man I never loved. I speak 4 languages but have no one to talk to. I can recite poetry but cannot read a street sign. They gave us education for slavery and called it culture. Today, tourists take selfies where women once faced execution. Topkapi Palace receives 3 million visitors annually. They walk through the harem quarters, now a museum, snapping photos of beautiful tiles and golden fixtures. The tour guides mention concubines and sultans' mothers. They don't mention the silk cords or the Bosphorus drownings. The gift shop sells Ottoman-themed jewelry and harem nights perfume. The marketing materials describe the mysterious world of beautiful women living in luxury. The word slavery appears nowhere. The systematic murder is reduced to a footnote about strict rules. History has been sanitized for tourist consumption. Here's what the textbooks leave out about the palace transformation. When it became a museum in 1924, workers discovered hidden rooms. Behind false walls, they found human remains. Under marble floors, they found bones. The restoration revealed 17 different burial sites within palace walls. The exact number of bodies was never publicized. Modern Turkey's relationship with this history is complicated. School textbooks mention the harem as part of Ottoman culture, but focus on architecture and administration. The human cost is minimized or ignored. When feminist historians raise these issues, they're accused of attacking Turkish heritage. The empire may be gone, but its defenders remain. The romanticization in media makes it worse. Every year brings new TV shows and movies depicting harem life as exotic romance. The Magnificent Century, Turkey's most popular historical drama, turned Roxolana into a love story. They show silk and jewels, not strangulation and sacks. They dramatize palace intrigue, not systematic femicide. Archaeological evidence keeps surfacing, refusing to let the story stay buried. In 2010, construction near Topkapi uncovered a mass grave. Forensic analysis showed 90% were women aged 15 to 25. Many showed signs of violence. The construction was quietly relocated. The bones were reburied without fanfare. The past was literally covered up again. Modern historians face an uphill battle. Dr. Madeline Zilfi, who wrote Women and Slavery in the Late Ottoman Empire, received death threats. Dr. Leslie Pierce was accused of perpetrating Western propaganda. Academic conferences on Ottoman slavery are protested. The truth is treated as an attack. But the evidence is overwhelming. Digitization of Ottoman archives has revealed documents scholars couldn't access before. Every year brings new proof of systematic horror, sales receipts for human beings, execution orders for pregnant women, budget allocations for disposal services. The bureaucracy of death left too much paperwork to hide. The lesson hits differently in our modern world. Every wedding photo at Topkapi Palace stands on bones. Every tourist delighting in Ottoman architecture walks through a crime scene. The tiles they admire were cleaned of blood. The gardens they photograph were fertilized with human remains. Beauty built on horror, the Ottoman legacy. Some argue we shouldn't judge history by modern standards. They say slavery was normal then, that every empire did terrible things. This deflection ignores scale and systematization. The Ottomans didn't just own slaves, they industrialized human disposal. They didn't just abuse women, they bureaucratized femicide. The harem system offers warnings for today. It shows how abuse becomes normalized when wrapped in tradition, how brutality gets justified by religion, how economic interests override human rights, how educated people can administer atrocity, how victims can become accomplices to survive. So what does this 500-year nightmare teach us? The answer requires confronting uncomfortable truths about human nature, institutional evil, and our capacity to forget horrors that don't fit our preferred narratives. We started with a simple statistic. 400 women enter, 3 survive. Now you understand the human reality behind those numbers. The silver tray that selected victims, the silk cords that strangled them, the leather sacks that drowned them, the palace walls that entombed them. This wasn't random cruelty. This was systematic femicide perfected over 500 years. The Ottoman Empire created a machine that consumed human beings with bureaucratic efficiency. They had budget lines for murder, quality standards for execution, and performance reviews for killers. They turned abuse into education, slavery into culture, and murder into administration. They built the most beautiful death factory in human history. But here's the ultimate revelation about human capacity for systematic evil. It wasn't operated by monsters. The men who strangled women went home to families. The eunuchs who selected victims for death were themselves victims of mutilation. The women who enforced harem rules were survivors turned perpetrators. Ordinary people operated an extraordinary horror because the system demanded it. The luxury and horror weren't separate, they were intertwined. The same silk that made beautiful clothes became nooses. The same marble that created architectural wonders hid bodies. The same education that produced brilliant administrators created broken children. The same gardens tourists photograph today were fertilized with human remains. Beauty and brutality were not opposites but partners. Let me bring this full circle with that silver tray, that simple object, a piece of metalwork that could be in any museum carried names that meant life or death. Women spent years dreading its appearance. Some poisoned themselves to avoid selection, others prayed to be chosen, thinking power meant safety. Both groups were wrong. The tray didn't carry opportunity, it carried doom with different timelines. What this reveals about power and abuse transcends the Ottoman Empire. When humans can own other humans, horror follows. When tradition excuses brutality, brutality becomes tradition. When economic interests conflict with human rights, humans lose. When abuse gets institutionalized, institutions become abusive. These aren't historical lessons, they're warnings. Similar systems exist today in different forms. Human trafficking generates $150 billion annually. Forced marriage affects 15 million women. Honor killings claim 5,000 lives yearly. The methods evolved, but the mentality remains. Some humans viewing others as property, using tradition and religion to justify horror. The importance of remembering accurately cannot be overstated. When we romanticize the past, we enable the present. Every harem knight's perfume bottle dishonors thousands of murdered women. Every exotic Ottoman romance novel whitewashes systematic rape. Every sanitized historical drama erases real suffering. Memory matters because forgetting enables repetition. Human nature's capacity for normalization should terrify us. The Ottoman palace operated for 500 years. Millions of people participated, buying, selling, guarding, killing. It wasn't hidden. Foreign ambassadors wrote reports. Travelers described horrors. Yet it continued because humans can normalize anything given enough time and justification. Let's talk about gratitude for a moment. Tonight, you'll go to bed without fearing a silver tray. Your natural biological functions won't trigger execution. Your children won't be collected by government officials. Your name appears in no one's human inventory. These freedoms, which seem basic, were denied to millions throughout history and are still denied to millions today. But gratitude must fuel vigilance. The Ottoman harem system didn't appear overnight. It evolved through small compromises, gradual normalizations, and systematic desensitization. Each generation inherited slightly worse conditions until horror became heritage. That's how systematic abuse always works, incrementally, with reasonable-sounding justifications. Modern human rights exist because people fought systems like this. Every protection in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights addresses a historical horror. Article 4 prohibits slavery because of systems like the Devshirme. Article 5 forbids torture because of normalized brutality. Article 16 protects marriage rights because of forced concubinage. Our rights are written in the blood of history's victims. Your personal freedom is not guaranteed, it's guarded, and it requires your participation. When you see human dignity violated, remember the harem women who had no voice. When tradition excuses